Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to the webinar today. I know it's Friday late, so I appreciate everybody coming. There is a lot to get through, so I am just going to get started. Chat is enabled, and I will try to field questions as we go. If there are a lot of questions, I can wait until the end, which might be easier in general. Okay. So, all right. Oops. I just had my controls go away. Okay, here we go. So I'm here to, not everybody here knows me. My name is Bree Lindsay, and I work with the California Council on Science and Technology, or CCST. And for those of you not familiar with CCST, we are a nonprofit independent organization that was designed to offer expert advice to the state of California and to recommend solutions to science and technology-related policy issues. And we're happily involved with the CCC Maker project so that we can offer information and professional development opportunities as well as connections to universities and California-based federal labs with which we're affiliated. So today I am going to just present some of the highlights from the first International Symposium on Academic Makerspaces. The symposium was organized by the Higher Education Maker Initiative, or HEMI, which is made up of 8 universities across the United States: Berkeley, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Olin College, Case Western Reserve, Stanford, Georgia Tech, and Yale. And the purpose of the symposium was to bring together practitioners in academic makerspaces to share knowledge and best practices, to learn from each other's triumphs and celebrate each other's failures. What they wanted to do was form a community that could share knowledge about how to get students excited about using the makerspaces, to guide the formation of safe, inclusive, and fun culture, to discuss various models for staffing, safety, and training. Hundreds of people who operate makerspaces came, and in fact, every continent except Antarctica was represented in the audience. The keynote for the symposium was given by Dale Doherty, founder and CEO of Make Media, which produces Make Magazine and Maker Fair. He's also the chair of the advisory committee for the CCC Maker project. And he gave a wide-ranging talk that emphasized how important the act of making is to humans in general, and said that maker culture is an antidote to consumer culture and meaningless, saying that our economy today is controlled by people who take, not the ones who make. He reminded the audience that he came from the open source software and documentation world, and that Make Magazine was actually named after the Unix utility Make, which is appropriate since the Maker movement was partially inspired by open source software, or maybe more by the open source community, which is a community of tool makers that openly share and build on each other's work. So the Maker movement essentially is bringing these open source values to the physical world. He also said that the crossroads where community meets culture and education meets economy is where innovation happens. And when he said this, it struck me that that's a pretty good description of community colleges. He also said that the most valuable output of makerspaces might be that they create change and foster innovation. And beyond the impacts of makerspaces on the world, he talked about the transformative nature of being part of a maker culture, saying that he believes people in the maker movement are making themselves as well as making things. And that seems like an important concept to keep in mind because community colleges are positioned to use their makerspaces not only to help train the workforce of the future, but also help guide community members of the future. And we're talking about helping students practice soft skills like critical thinking and collaboration, as well as understanding other perspectives and working constructively to solve problems. He mentioned that the maker movement and institutions of higher ed share the same goals of engaging the community to produce learning. He also mentioned later in the symposium, but it fits in here, that universities are perfectly positioned to actually study the impacts that makerspaces have on student learning outcomes. So everyone in attendance agreed that that's the direction we need to be moving in to continue making strides. He also mentioned that makerspaces are most valuable not as standalone thanks, Carol, very much. That makerspaces are most valuable not as standalone facilities, but as network nodes and community hubs. Since the goal is to share and build upon each other's work and experiences, makerspaces shouldn't be operating all by themselves. And this seems especially relevant since the CCC Maker mission is to incorporate so many different campuses and have a working community of practice. Thanks, everybody who said you can hear me. I wasn't sure. So this was a really full meeting. Carol was there and I think could attest to the fact that there were very full days and some evenings where people were really eager to share their experiences. And we were treated to days full of talks. And a lot of the presentations themselves, along with the proceedings and the videos that were presented at the meeting, are located on the ISAM website, which I provided a link to at the bottom here. I tried to remember for the rest of this presentation to include page numbers where you can find more information about certain points that I make in these symposium proceedings so that you can really drill down into the things that you found interesting. And this meeting had so many different perspectives from people with various levels of makerspace experience. It kind of could seem like it was all over the place. But really, when I was thinking about it, several themes emerged. First, there was a lot of talk about starting up makerspaces and the logistics of running a makerspace. So talks included trying to figure out who the makerspace will serve, costs of materials, how to manage purchasing, where to house makerspaces, various examples of makerspace models. There were also discussions about safety issues that academic makerspaces face and how speakers have dealt with them. And there was discussion about the kinds of skills that students and others can learn and practice within a makerspace. A good deal of discussion took place where these ideas overlapped. So people presented about different staffing models, ways to train the staff to operate equipment safely and teach others to do the same. And there was some discussion on how to work with other staff and faculty on campus to get through safety hurdles, space issues, and just general collaboration. But the one idea that came up over and over was the crucial role that culture and community play in sustaining a successful makerspace. So, one of the first talks that was given was by the MIT Maker Czar, Marty Culpepper, who was presiding over most of this conference. And he talked about the different flavors of academic makerspaces. He talked about one type of makerspace flavor, which is a machine shop, and it has as its mission to provide highly skilled resources for fabrication, is generally staffed by technicians, and this type of space can be scaled up and be more accessible with more staff availability. Another type of community space down on the bottom right of this triangle, a makerspace, is something that's called a community space, where makers get together, sometimes have simple tools, members mentor each other and learn to make. There's pretty much flat ownership, responsibility, and accountability. And these types of spaces scale up with the size of the interested community. And another type of space that he mentioned was project space, which supports classes and research programs and is generally staffed by technicians. So this type of space would scale up with enrollment. He said that he got asked a lot of the time, I'm about to start up a makerspace, which type should I choose? And he wanted to emphasize that there's no right choice. It's just what is best for the environment that you have. But he did note that, at least at MIT, and I think others might agree, they've had what he said was an exceedingly difficult time growing maker communities inside of machine shops. So he suggested definitely making sure that there was some community space, because community grows most easily in these spaces. And here, Marty's talking about a maker system with a combination of different maker spaces available to students and getting the balance of which spaces are available to them just right. But other talks were talking about how to combine these elements into single maker spaces. So this is, if you don't have the luxury of having many maker spaces on your campus, this is something that you can still be thinking about when moving toward your own maker space or making improvements on your own. There was a talk given by an architect who discussed how designing a makerspace is overall a linear process in concept, but it is actually collaborative, iterative, and exploratory. He said that an important first step in designing the space is establishing the parameters. So knowing your space limitations, the population and equipment needs, budgets and schedules, designing for the people using the space. And he said that the most common pitfalls included short-sighted approaches to systems like mechanical, electrical, and plumbing infrastructure, and also underestimating campus-wide interest in making, because it's harder to expand once you've built your space. He also said that it was a mistake to always assume that your architect knows what you mean when you ask questions. And another interesting talk was given about the SNU Idea Factory. The SNU Idea Factory is a brand new makerspace in Seoul, South Korea, which is on the campus of Seoul National University. This is a really interesting space because it arose from a project called the SNU Creative Spaces Project, which was spearheaded by an undergraduate student who really wanted to build an urban disaster pre-warning system and found nowhere to do so on her campus. So she got frustrated and went to the dean of her engineering department, and he encouraged her to create a team. And so this team of students carried out a project where they researched makerspaces and produced a planning guide for their school. And part of the planning concept, the space concept that they chose was based on experimental space uses. So what they did is they had information about how some makerspaces operate, and then they found available spaces where they could occupy and have small projects started, and then observe the users in the space, and then survey the users afterward and say, what did you like about the way this was set up? What did you not like about the way this was set up? And they used that to inform the design for their space. The plan was actually adopted and built at the school, and it's just a really good example of how students can be a very powerful force for advocating for space, and also how important it is to be thinking about the space use, the kind of programming and resources that you need to be putting in each makerspace. And another type of makerspace that was mentioned was biomakerspaces. One of the projects that was mentioned as happening inside of a biomakerspace was a partnership between a local foundation and a university in which students actually sequenced urban microbiomes and mapped it and released that publicly. The speaker also talked about a Fab Lab Network distributed course called How to Grow Almost Anything, which is a play off of MIT's course, How to Make Almost Anything. And that's available to the Fab Lab Network. But one insight that the speaker had that was interesting was that the interaction between the maker students and the bio students who were both working in the same place was really positive. So maker kids were teaching the bio kids how to use the equipment that they needed to carry out certain aspects of their project. And The bio kids were teaching the maker kids what their projects were about while they were receiving this training. And so it was a really interesting kind of give and take between different populations in the same space. Another kind of makerspace, or maker system really, that was described was Penn State's statewide 3D printing system, which is part of DigiNet. DigiNet is a platform that shows what resources are available to Penn State system students and where. But what he spent a lot of time talking about was the 3D printing system, which was really interesting. So students could submit jobs online to have 3D prints made. And the 3D printers were housed in libraries, so they could actually use a system that was already available to them, the interlibrary loan system, to deliver these finished products to students all over the state. So a student sets up their project, sets up their CAD file, submits a job online, is put into the queue, and is told when to pick up their finished project at their campus library. And this idea generated a lot of interesting discussion that included whether it was a good idea for students to receive the final product without seeing it made. The idea being that there were some failures of these 3D print jobs, and students might not be able to understand what made their design fail without seeing the product collapse on itself. They just received like messed up versions of what they were expecting. But it's a really interesting, different concept that networks can be thinking about, kind of distributed resources and how different students can have access even if they don't have the specific tools on their campus. One really interesting talk came from Carnegie Mellon, who spoke about starting up their makerspace called ID8, which stands for Integrative Design, Arts, and Technology. They talked a bit about balancing starting out with generating interest in the community or with generating funding first. The trade-off being that if you generate a lot of interest first, then you have limited bandwidth. But if you go funding first, then you have limited community to begin with. So there's a trade-off. And so he discussed building relationships with different types of stakeholders that would be interested in your makerspace and how important community relationships are. And he talked about different stakeholders in a way that I think is a really good resource for people who want to go look at this paper. He talked about administrative stakeholders as being the ones who characteristically would be very happy to help, always very happy to help. But one of the very good things about this group, he said, was that they were also happy to not help if you needed no help. And so that was a really important type of stakeholder. He said the passive stakeholder was one that uses the space but is often more concerned than anything. And this group is usually your largest group, so your users who have some issue in the space and come to you with their concerns. And he said the good thing about this group of stakeholders is they are the quick change makers because they're the ones who bring the issues to the front and advocate for themselves. And he said the bad thing about these interactions with passive users is that often the concerns come without any constructive advice, so there's no solution given. But he said one way that you could help this kind of interaction is to actually make it explicit, meaning even post a sign in your space that makes it a part of the culture. Anytime you have a concern, I'm extremely happy to listen to you, but please come with at least 5 solutions so that whenever there is a concern raised, we can be moving forward and changing it. That kind of interaction could actually transition a passive stakeholder into what he called proactive stakeholders. Proactive stakeholders, he said, were those who were using the space extensively and who were very interested in the health of the space and advocating for it. And these ones were the stakeholders who drove the evolution of the space. He also said that when they have concerns, they typically tended to come up with a whole bunch of solutions. So those are some of the kinds of community relationships he described. But another thing that I remembered from his talk that I wanted to share, because it's not in the paper, which is a great resource, was an anecdote that was about how he generated funding to sustain his makerspace. There was not a lot of talk about funding in this conference, so I was really happy that he went into as much depth as he did. Basically, he was trying to generate interest from funders, and he decided that he would invite the advisory board and the board of trustees to a dinner each semester in the Makerspace, where students could present projects they'd completed in the Makerspace and get people interested. And ahead of the dinner, he was thinking, it would be really great to get them engaged and connected to the Makerspace, and I bet that could happen if I could actually get them to use the tools in the space. But then he checked himself because he doubted whether the board members themselves would actually engage. So what he did was he decided to invite their whole families, so that it ended up the families were very excited. They were the ones who got really excited about the space, couldn't stop talking about how great the Makerspace was, and after using the tools themselves, advocated for it on their own to the board members. And the other thing he did was he had them leave their projects with their names on them. He let kids keep their projects because that's nice. But he had their families leave their projects with their names on them as inspirational pieces in the Makerspace and said, you can come pick up your projects the following semester. So that kept the board members engaged in this space. And he found that having these dinner time talks led to a tenfold increase in funding. So that's just a really creative way to be thinking about relationships and how they can benefit your makerspace. Another operational point that was discussed was this introduction of the Mobius Maker System management app out of MIT. So this was an app that was created through collaboration between students, administration, and alumni, safety officers, facility managers, and other stakeholders on the MIT campus to decrease barriers to making on the campus. So this app actually allows students to search and find machines anywhere on campus, gives them directions on how to get there, tells them what entry requirements are available or are required for each space, and actually stores their training credentials on their phones in the app so that they can show technicians in a new space what their training level is for specific equipment. And the technicians, in turn, have a trusted source that they know that this person is able to or not able to work on this specific equipment. They also use MakerBucks on the MIT campus. So the app allows them to purchase consumables as needed at each space. Let's see. Another talk that was given had to do with how to manage purchasing in a student-run makerspace. The idea was to have a system set up where there were approval processes for different levels of spending that could be made. The approval could be made by treasurers the treasurer of the group running the space at a lower level of purchasing, and then as that level goes up, you need more and more approval. This paper in particular could be very helpful for people trying to figure out how to set up purchasing in general, because they have information on what kinds of, like how they set up their spreadsheets, what kind of forms they use to track their spending, and how to budget for different materials needed in the makerspace. Another talk that concerned starting up a makerspace was about surveying students, surveying users of the makerspace before you actually build it or set aside space for it or move equipment into a space. This is a 35-question survey that was developed by faculty who work in makerspaces, students who work in makerspaces, and MIT's Institutional Research Office, as well as I think the Provost's office. This is freely available on our website. I sent you the link, and they just released this publicly, I think, a couple of weeks ago. But these 35 questions can help you identify what potential users of your Makerspace are going to want. And even though MIT had a lot of experience setting up Makerspaces and they thought they had a very thriving environment, they were still very surprised at some of the responses that they got after sending out this survey. So one of the surprises they had was that 24/7 access would be nice, but was definitely not necessary for the large majority of students who would be using the space. They also learned that the majority of making activities was happening off campus. And this was at a time when they had machine shops available to students, and they were very surprised that they were making off campus, and that led them to realize that they needed more community-based type spaces, and so they started incorporating that into the kind of makerspaces they were building. Also, looking at the kind of things that students like to make helped inform them of what sort of equipment was required and would get the most use and would be worth buying and making space for. So this might be, if not exactly perfect for your environment, it might be a really good place to start with questions on how you might be surveying the people who are likely to use your space. Okay, so of course there was a lot of talk about safety as well. One discussion was about emerging health and safety concerns in academic makerspaces. And this talk mostly pointed out that there are health hazards beyond the acute injuries, the things that we often think about when walking into a shop. So just pointing out that laser cutters and 3D printers can generate air contaminants in the form of VOCs and particulates in the air, and the potential health impacts of 3D printers in particular are not well studied. So a number of conference participants pointed this out, and the consensus was, yes, the community needs to be doing studies to establish safety thresholds for things like this. And that's one of the reasons that they so badly wanted to have this conference and get people together so that people could see what information was missing for everybody and what kinds of questions need to be answered to move forward. Georgia Tech talked about their peer-to-peer training, which guarantees or helps their makerspace to be a safe space for students who are running it. And they talked about a problem of losing expertise through graduation of the trained members and their need for a more sustainable methodological training solution. What they came up with was students teaching each other on each machine. So this led to a more inviting environment because the students are being taught by their peers, who are called prototyping instructors or PIs, instead of being taught by traditional machine shop personnel. So students are able to come learn equipment on their own schedule through the availability of walk-in training on most machines. And students who want a more structured approach to training in a more formal environment can also join scheduled training workshops that are also led by student mentors in this space. If students want to learn a machine, but don't have a particular project in mind, they can also attend evening workshop events where everybody completes a similar project. In exchange for their services, PIs have 24 access to the equipment along with other perks. And these kinds of perks motivate a lot of students to try to become PIs, which is accomplished by completing a checklist. So a checklist where each area of the checklist denotes a specific type of machinery. And in order to get checked off on that and signed off by another PI, the student would need to demonstrate their ability to work with the machine by creating a specific item. And once that is done, the proficient student is a PI and is trained on the machine, is able to do it. They can also apply to become a master of the machine this training is accomplished by other masters who are also students. And what's required is to go through a curriculum that trains them on how to use the machine safely and properly, also teaches them how to maintain and repair the machinery, and any nuances that are specific to that machine. And then these masters are able to, one more thing is that they need to complete a complex project on that machinery in order to achieve the master status. And one thing that they mentioned about how this works is that it having the peer-to-peer interaction in the makerspace really kind of organically gave rise to a safety culture, because they're seeing their peers doing things the right way, so it never looks uncool to be wearing, for instance, safety goggles or doing things the proper way. That was what they were saying. Another talk about a safety-based culture in a student-run makerspace came out of the MIT Maker Workshop. And this safety culture was achieved through student-run training. So student volunteers called mentors would offer weekly training hours that would cover safe and correct operation of machinery and tools, and then the mentors would determine whether a user was certified to use the machine after the training was over. They emphasized that the rules and standards in this space are very transparent. They're written and posted all over in visible spaces. And they also mentioned, though, that cameras are installed and used to ensure that everybody's following the rules, and that there were a couple of benefits to having the cameras. They would have webcams that were trained on each piece of machinery, so that a student who wanted to know if a particular piece of equipment was available could just look on the camera and see if that equipment was free. But they also kept this feed for a week or so that if, for instance, somebody made a mess or there was an accident or something, somebody could go back and look and see exactly what happened. But aside from that, the point of this talk was partly that it's very important to the safety of the culture safety, that the shared sense of ownership of the space and wanting to protect it from being closed down due to accidents or unsafe practices. In addition to the safety culture that was talked about a lot, Yale talked about a control banding approach that could be used to identify, evaluate, and control hazards. There's a lot of detail in this paper, too, so it might be a good framework to evaluate for using within a makerspace. So it's based on classifying hazards associated with specific machine tools and pieces of equipment. And he mentioned that the most obvious hazards posed by tools and equipment are, of course, the acute physical injuries at the point of operation, which you never want, but also that there were less obvious things, like we talked about before with the particulates in the air or high noise levels causing hearing damage. And I just lost I apologize, I just lost my screen. And so I lost my train of thought. Okay. So he talked about less obvious hazards. Oh, and then he also talked about the underappreciated potential chronic health impacts that some tools can pose, and said that these things need to be considered in different classes of hazard. And the purpose, they propose using the safety control banding as a guide for training, access, oversight, and the use of machine tools and equipment. And specifically, certain hazard classes of equipment could be stored together so that access could be controlled more easily, and only adequately trained users would be granted access. So classifying tools in that way also gives guidance to the minimum level of training required to even enter the Makerspace, regardless of whether you're going to be using the tools, and would definitely inform of what level of training is required to access different areas in the Makerspace. So we talked about high-risk, high-hazard machinery being kept behind a door that could be locked so that the access could be easily controlled based on what training credentials you had. And then, of course, he also emphasized that the culture of safety is still very important, even with controls like these in place. So that safety is practice-based and not enforcement-driven. A presentation out of the Graz University of Technology in Austria talked about how they set up a short course in their Makerspace, the Fab Lab Graz. And what they did is they looked at what Fab Labs are doing worldwide, looked at examples of courses that are taught at universities that have Makerspaces, such as MIT's How to Build Almost Anything. And then what they did is they surveyed their own students, the users of Fab Lab Graz, to see what kinds of learning they enjoyed and what they would find most valuable in a course. So from this information, they developed a short course that was confined to take place over 5 days because they were trying to fit it in between already scheduled courses at the university. So the paper in the proceedings takes you through the exact method they used to develop their course and what they learned along the way. But one of the main take-homes here was that their course differed from a lot of the courses that they found in their studies because they focused on their own students and how they prefer to learn, which was a little different, with fewer theory lectures and more on-demand theoretical input than what is frequently being offered by academic makerspaces in university settings. So again, it's important to know how people want to learn when designing courses in makerspaces. UC Berkeley also presented about how they're using their Makerspace. And it's interesting because they're really harnessing the fact that they're in a university that has a lot of research activity going on. And so they're focusing in this talk about how they're integrating research about making into their Makerspaces. Specifically, they were looking at educational research and qualitative observational research and how that can improve our fundamental understanding of values of making for students, as well as showing what kind of hurdles makers face today through careful study of making and practice. They're also looking at how makers can serve as a new target audience for technology research and development in engineering disciplines, so making for makers through engineering. And looking at how research projects in a large number of domains can use Makerspace resources to accelerate their progress and also to engage students in the Makerspace to turn fundamental discoveries into usable devices and services. What they suggest as metrics that are important to describe how making activities connect to the core academic mission of knowledge production and how research is being integrated include the number of research artifacts or instruments that are built in a Makerspace, how many papers are enabled by the Makerspace, what number of researchers is served, how many undergrads are involved in the research, things like that. Moving on to, this was one of my favorite talks in the entire conference, and I think a lot of people's. There was this presentation about developing models for an engineering course was given by a student at the Universidad del Valle de Guatemala, and people were surprised when they found out she was a student and thought she was a grad student. And then it turned out at the end that she was I think a second-year undergraduate student. It was just, her presentation was so impressive and the things she was talking about was wonderful. But what she talked about was creating learning models for mechanical engineering classes. And she talked about how her Student Association of Mechanical Engineering was approached by the Mechanical Engineering Department of her university to transform a Toyota pickup truck that was in disrepair into different mechanical learning models. So she described the student-led project that was carried out in their Makerspace, starting with how they planned out the project and how they did their fundraising, which they made keychains in their Makerspace and then sold them to students during Valentine's Day. And they made everything except for like $150 of what they needed, which they filled in with a bake sale. And they tallied up their expenses at the end and found that the project, it cost them a lot less than what it would have cost to purchase a pre-made model for the same end. Then the students who worked on these projects, beyond the cost savings and beyond what they learned just planning out a project, the students who worked on these projects in the Makerspaces ended up learning a good deal about how different auto parts worked, even though that wasn't really why they were there. They were just machining different parts of the model. So these models have been used in a lot of classes and been displayed during engineering events on their campus. And she has a lot of information about how much it costs them, how many students have used the models in her paper, so it's worth checking out. Another kind of skills building that can be done in Makerspaces, a little more professional, like even just teaching. So this talk also falls under the staffing model sort of sub-theme, but it works very well in the skills building too. So Stanford has a product realization lab, and the PRL has paid TAs who are mostly master's students and have all spent large amounts of time in the PRL working on their own products already. So they are familiar with the culture of the space. They know how the space works. And Marlo, who gave this talk, said that the most significant product of the PRL is these highly trained teaching assistants who take their skills into industry, and the skill sets that they gain teaching others in this makerspace are highly valued, especially in Silicon Valley where the PRL is well known. So that's a good argument for connecting your makerspace to the community so that people really trust the kind of skills building that's going on in your makerspace. And the other thing is that, as the Venn diagram here shows, she had in her paper, but I've also seen in other places, a lot of spaces have very different staffing models, but a lot of academic spaces are actually moving toward student-staffed models. And so TAs were being trained and paid, and also solving the staffing model, the staffing issue for this makerspace. One anecdote that she brought up about teaching in this space was about how the TAs and professors too would teach students to learn resilience in the face of failure, which is an important skill to have when working in a makerspace. And she said that it starts on day one. So when teaching or TAing a key design class, the teacher is telling the students, all of them, to stand up, raise their arms, and shout, "I failed," over and over and over again until people are really giggling. And the exercise is meant to set the tone early that failure is not only commonplace, but learning from that failure is to be celebrated. And so the TAs are meant to echo this sentiment throughout their training of other students. Okay. So Harvard had a good talk about how important culture is in the makerspace, basically by talking about a makerspace where the culture was not correct. And so at this makerspace, a lot of the maker activities were being done inside of coursework. There was no student access outside of classes, and so there was no tinkering culture. So in order to help stimulate this, the speaker worked with students to advocate for space to use outside of class. And space was precious on campus, and there is a makerspace that is planned to open in 2020. So people were not necessarily interested in actually funding a space for students in the interim. So finding no space was available. They worked with machine shop technicians and compromised on a one-night-a-week workshop that was staffed by trained technicians who could let them have access to the shop space. These project nights were themed, so students didn't have to feel intimidated if they didn't have a particular project in mind. And in addition to these themed workshops in the shop space, they also opened non-shop spaces that could feature low-tech workshops like bike nights, so that students could learn to fix and maintain their own bikes, just to get familiar with doing things with their hands. One of the things that she talked about, she also talked about celebrating failure in a really fun way, which was in the shop they had a wall of shame where they encouraged students to post just massive failures, like just globs of failed print jobs and awful welding results. And it became sort of a sense of pride to see how bad the failures could be. And that helped with the culture a lot and just lowering the boundaries for people who would feel anxious to come into the space. Her talk also kind of highlights how important it is to get students involved in advocating for Makerspace and resources. And the University of Delaware had a talk that was great, and it was not just about making the space inviting for women, but there was a point that was made that I thought was very interesting, and it was made by a couple of other people as well, which was that they found if you gave students, particularly women in this case, a private place to fail, so they could work on projects independently so that they could fail without an audience, that helped them to be more comfortable in the space. And by the time that they finished their project, they were as comfortable as anybody else in the space. So that's another point of culture that came up a lot in various ways. Georgia Tech talked about barriers as well, saying that it's important to have a welcoming, inclusive environment that isn't intimidating for newcomers, but there are barriers that they had seen in makerspaces, like people who are anxious because they didn't have enough experience, or people who didn't have enough information about equipment so that they could run it confidently. People were afraid of being alienated, and the idea that makerspaces are only for engineers came up a lot. And so through a combination of training and programming, they tried to address all of these barriers to try to lower them and have a more inclusive and diverse culture. One solution was to have walk-in training. This is the lab, remember, where they have student peer-to-peer training. So they have walk-in training, which is helps improve confidence because they're learning from their peers and they're also learning through doing. They raised awareness of space through numerous advertised workshops that focused on providing fabrication experience to newcomers. They also offer weekly tours that provide information about the studio. And there's a first-year seminar that all incoming students take that's supposed to ease students from all majors into campus life. And they have those people go on tours as well. And then they also had ladies' night and workshops that were inclusive to a lot of different groups so that people would feel comfortable after leaving that workshop that they could come back again and they would belong. Oh, that's why. One of the campus relationship kind of discussions that was talked about was how just basic analogies can actually help you to communicate with people who don't necessarily want to help you make a makerspace, or who do but have concerns. And so Marty Culpepper was the one giving this talk, and he was a little flip. But one of the things that he said a couple of times was, when people say they're worried somebody will get hurt, have them look at all of the types of safety training that you do in the makerspace, and have them compare data on makerspace accidents with sports injury statistics, and have them see that, yeah, there's risk, but it's worth it. And another thing that he mentioned that wasn't in this paper, but that he said somewhere else to describe the value of a makerspace is, if makers can make outside of makerspace, then why should we invest in that? And he said, well, it's very important to exercise. We all think that that's important. Why should we have to do it in a gym? People don't have any problem investing in certain kinds of facilities, and you just have to make them see that this is an important facility. So that was his point there. So I tried to cover a lot. There is a lot more, and it just couldn't fit into an hour at all. But if you have any specific questions and you don't feel like looking through the 300 pages of papers that were submitted, you can always email me. But these are the take-homes that I got from this conference. First and foremost, though there were so many high-powered institutions there, everybody's still just starting out. Even those who have had makerspaces for a while are still discovering a lot of new things. There isn't a one-size-fits-all model, and it's important to know what you want out of your space in your environment. So it's important to invest time in getting the culture right and your community engaged. And a lot of people have faced the same challenges over and over, so it's important to leverage your resources. Use your network, talk to your colleagues who are going through the same thing. One of the things that was really clear at the end of this conference is that a lot of the evidence is still anecdotal. Rather than having quantitative studies about makerspace impacts in one realm or another, we're hearing a lot of great stories, but there aren't a lot of data points. So what's really exciting is that participating in CCC Maker, everybody in this network is getting to contribute to a growing and exciting body of information in research. And so community colleges in California can help be pioneers on the higher ed maker frontier nationwide. The purpose of this symposium was to bring together groups who were already working on all of the same things but in isolation, and to create a network that they can lean on. CCC Maker is already networked. So from the very beginning, just starting out, many of you already have more resources than some of these universities had when they began. And not only that, but this group would be very happy to connect with you as well. So there are more resources available on the ISAM, the International Symposium on Academic Makers 2016 webpage on MIT's Managed Project website, and I've included the link here. There's also, in addition to other online collaborative sources, MIT has started MakerShare, which is an online place where you can go and have discussions with other people who are having a lot of the challenges and triumphs that everybody else in the maker world, in the academic maker world, are having. There's also a brand new journal coming out of academic makerspaces and making, and a global academic society, maker society, that you can join if you're interested. Also, there are a whole bunch of videos from the conference, the proceedings, and a lot of the presentations themselves are stored at this page, so it's a good place to go. One last thing I wanted to do before I ask questions is to, not that, is to insert a poll. CCST would like to offer some regional symposia. And I am just trying to do a yes or no poll real quick, which I should have done already. These would be in early to mid-April on a Friday, so maybe the first and third Friday in April, one in Southern California, one in Northern California. That would bring together people to talk about what you're going through in your network, and then also some experts in the maker movement who could help you maybe even look at your designs and give ideas about how they handled certain challenges that you either have or will face. And I am just interested to know who would be interested in coming to something like that. Before putting the resources in, we want to make sure that people would actually show up. There are only 8 people here, but I'm still interested to know if people would be interested in coming. And I'll just leave a couple more minutes or seconds to respond. So far I'm getting pretty favorable responses, so that's great. I know that a lot of you traveled really far to get to the symposia this summer, but also that a lot of you really benefited from actually talking face-to-face with people in your network. So we just wanted to make sure that this was useful to you. And I am getting good responses from people, so as soon as we, apparently it's very, very hard for me to type chat and speak into a phone with no feedback. NorCal preferred dates after April 7th. Okay. For those who might have missed the beginning of the webinar, the page numbers are referring to the proceedings of the symposium, and those are available on the ISAM website, ISAM 2016 website. Also, there's going to be another how do we get the paper? You get the paper by going to the website and just downloading the proceedings. It should be right at the top on the MIT ISAM 2016 website. So if you could even just Google it. I just realized you might not be getting the slides from this talk immediately upon when I finish this. But just Google MIT Manus ISAM 2016, and it'll take you to their website, and that's where all of the resources that I put on the last slide are. Okay, we got a pretty positive response about ISAM. ISAM is the acronym for International Symposium on Academic Makerspaces. Right, so what I was going to say is that there's going to be another one in 2017, and I think that judging from the people who were there and the excitement in the room when Carol spoke about CCC Maker, I think it would be really exciting if people from CCC Maker could actually submit something to that conference, even just as a paper if you aren't able to go. I think it would be really cool to connect to the people there. So hopefully this has been a good webinar for everybody. There is a lot more in the proceedings. I know it's a giant document, but I think that I've given a decent overview. So hopefully this has been helpful for everybody, and it was wonderful to be here today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll talk to you soon.